Hello and welcome. We are here in Greece, Rhodes, and with me is Gabriela Ramos, who has been the Sherpa for OECD countries to G20 for about a decade now, and she's also the Chief of Staff at OECD. Thanks very much for giving this time for us and talking to us.
Thanks for inviting me, Pankaj.
How worried you are right now about global economic slowdown?
We wish we were not that worried, but we are. We are because at the moment where we were achieving some kind of taking off of the global economy, the trade measures between major economies of the world hit. And what we are seeing is that it has affected growth through several channels. It has affected growth through lower levels of trade, and trade is a real engine for growth. Trade usually grows at 3 times the level of growth in GDP, and now we are at 1%. Global economy around 3%, but slowing down. All the international institutions are revising downwards their perspectives for growth, but the trade flows in itself are being hit with the protectionist measures. But then you also have the hit that brings in investment. And I would say that the problem is that we like to work in silos and think that trade is one thing, investment is another, jobs are not. They are all interlinked. And the trade measures, the biggest impact is in investment flows. And according to our numbers, when you see the impressive slowdown of investment, the flat investment, because of course investors are not putting money in new productive activities if they don't know if they are going to be able to sell at what price, because these trade measures are continuing. But the greatest casualty has to do with confidence. And confidence is the glue that brings the economy together, but it's also the glue that brings people together. And I think this is what is really worrisome.
There was a time when we used to talk about that the economic relationships of two countries are separate from political relationships of two countries. We have seen for a long time, say between the United States and China, that politics were divergent, but their economies were working together. They had a huge trade which was going on, one-sided almost, because the US had trade deficit with China always. But now do you think that the politics has started interfering with economy and business?
No, I think it will be a very simple reading. The reality is that politics has always had a very in terms of how the economics function. The fact is that during the last 3 decades, what we have been experiencing is a very decisive move into more integration. And the fact is that many of the US businesses decided to offshore their productions, and much of a very important part of the growth dynamics in India and China had been related to FDI. It has been related to these very important decisions that companies have made. The problem is that now the reading and the willingness of countries to cooperate is really faltering. That's the problem. I don't know if it is the politics or not. Maybe it's also related to the fact that the results of the growth model that we have followed has not delivered for people, and therefore politics are becoming more complex inside countries and between countries. But they have never been detached. Economics and politics are always linked.
Always interlinked.
Always interlinked.
Yeah. That brings me to India specifically. The new chief of the IMF has said that the impact of the global slowdown is more on India. It shows more on India than in the rest of the economies. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, because you are an economy that has been opening to the world, and therefore you are also very integrated in global value chains, in production processes that cut across several countries and cut across several borders. And therefore, if you see that borders are being, the tariffs have been imposed to make more costly the transactions that you usually do in a very swift manner, the reality is that it impacts growth. But more importantly, India has been a major recipient of investment, foreign investment, major recipient. I think that you have a lot of strengths that have captured the imagination of foreign investors in terms of your workforce, in terms of the quality, in terms of language, in terms of the technological developments in India. You have really become a very attractive investment place. But as I said, investments are completely stalled.
What can India do to attract more investments in this situation where there is, as you said, there is a trust deficit between countries? The global economy is on a slowdown. What can India do specifically to increase these investments? Our Prime Ministers have been doing a lot. He's been traveling to different countries, inviting investments. What specifically do you think we can do back in Delhi which will help us?
If you talk about the systemic issue, of course we are counting on all the G20 countries to continue talking among leaders to make sure that everybody understands how much these trade actions are hurting everybody. That's a fact, because you are not going to solve it by only taking domestic policies by India, because if the international context is so confrontational, it's not going to be about India, but you will be affected. In terms of domestic policies, I think that you are advancing in a very important agenda of modernization. I know that you are advancing in the question of skills, education, infrastructure. This amazing project that you have for registration of millions of Indians, digitalization, advancement of technology. I think that those are the decisions that are under your control, and that I feel that the Prime Minister is putting a lot of emphasis to continue investing in those areas that are making India, but will continue to make India a very interesting partner for international economic cooperation. But on the other hand, the real question here is systemic, and therefore India as a member of the G20 and next presidency of the G20, I think that it's very important that you use this standing of being the next presidency to try to foster cooperation. We have very good outcomes that we should not neglect, because the environment is so depressing that people sometimes don't see the outcomes. But just yesterday the OECD delivered a unified solution for taxing digital.
Yes, that's right.
And we will be discussing, and we will see, because we have 1 year to make it work for everybody. But at the end, multilateralism is delivering. International cooperation always deliver better. And I think that's a message that we always hear from India, and we'd like to hear it more.
Yeah, in that case, India has been at the receiving end of some of the sanctions by the United States in terms of trade. We are trying to get a trade deficit better with the United States, and the President of the United States has been asking us, before India takes presidency of G20, do you think we should be more lenient in hitting back, as they say, in this tit-for-tat trade practices?
No, because that's a race to the bottom. That's a race to the bottom. And my main message to you is that the narrative is wrong. The narrative is wrong. We don't live in a Ricardian world of comparative advantages where I sell you some things and you sell me some things, and we export products. We don't export products. As I said, we are in these global value chains where production processes are distributed in several countries, where investment is underlying all these production processes, that if you go for trade tariffs, you're hurting your investment, you're hurting your technology, you're hurting other flows, financial flows. It's so interlinked that it's not only about trade, and we need to measure trade differently, because it's not about deficits. Sometimes you might have a US-India deficit, but if you look at the investment part, the investment are American investors.
Long-term view. We have to take
long-term
a long-term
view, yeah.
of everything. Which also brings me to another very important question which we keep talking about in India, and that is of getting the lot of the people higher in terms of their incomes. You're talking about middle-level income groups today. We still have a long way to go there. And in 2010, it was considered that if we had a 10% growth each year, then by mid-20s, we'll pull out millions of Indians out of poverty, and we'll become a middle income level country. Do you think that when these trade imbalances happen, when countries don't talk to each other, it's the poorer countries like India get hurt more than the richer nations like OECD, United States, China?
Given the nature of the challenges of countries like mine, Mexico, your country, India, of course, because people are are more vulnerable, are more at risk, probably have less buffers to defend. We don't have a general unemployment insurance, for example. We don't have universal pension systems. India still needs to build up the universal health care. So, of course, if you don't have this dynamic of growth, and also we have growing populations. The majority of the rest of the OECD countries are aging. We need to produce jobs for the young people that are getting into the markets. We need to prepare them. So yes, of course, the impact is asymmetric. But as I said, the question is, you mentioned it, how do we do to really bring people out of this vulnerable condition? And the international economy will provide some solutions, which comes with the interlinkages. But domestically, I think that we really need to redefine the purpose of growth. Growth is fine. We all need growth. But if that growth is not distributed fairly, and it's only concentrated at the top, which is happening in all the countries, including India, including Mexico, is not going to work. And if that growth is achieved destroying the whole natural base in which we need to survive, is not going to work. So the message that we are trying to share in the OECD is that it's not growth per se, but how you grow. Investment in people, in regions, and firms that are left behind. And that will bring higher levels of growth. But this should be the priority.
But there is a proposition that if countries like Mexico and India, they provide safety nets, what we're talking about, pensions, educations, healthcare, then you are not following the free market dictum. And in India, reforms are seen as that we have to become more free market. There should be more private enterprise. So there is this contradiction.
I think it's again a wrong narrative. There is no competitive free market without government regulation and without government institutions that will ensure that happens. And I have to say that I have not seen any advanced economy, the UK, the US, or the Southeast Asian economies developing without a very strong, efficient, capable public sector. I'm sorry, we need to invest in our public sectors. Nobody is going to advance in their development pattern if it doesn't have an empowering state. And we need to change this growth narrative in which markets will deliver, because markets are very important. They are the source of innovation, they are the source of transactions, but they are not the only player. We need governance.
We have this argument now in India that the government has no business to be in business. You are talking about public institutions, public sector. Our public sector airlines are in a bad shape. Our public sector telecom companies are in a bad shape. Public sector coal mines are in a bad shape. The public sector banks have huge debts. How does it work then? What is the way out? How can we?
No, because I'm not talking that. I'm not referring to the old model in which the state will just squeeze out the private sector and take over economic sectors. We know that that's not the way. It had proven wrong in Latin America and many other areas of the world. What I'm saying is that you need a strong government and a strong regulator to make sure that the framework in which the economic transactions happen is a fair, a dynamic, open framework. Who's going to control the private monopolies? In my country, telecommunication monopoly costs 2 percentage points of GDP every year. The minute the monopoly was cut down, prices went down, subscriptions went up. So you need this very important regulation. And I have to say that we need to be dogmatic. We should stop being dogmatic, because at the end, what happened with the financial sector was going to collapse. The government took over.
Yes, where the government will have the money to run things.
Let's just understand that not to control economic sectors, but the regulatory framework, particularly in the digital age, has to be from a very effective, competent government.
One last question, which is about education. You talked about education, that the parents if you have a parent who is a graduate, 65% chances that you will make into the middle level income group. That's exactly what India wants. Currently, our graduation level is about 25% in the entire country. How do we invest more in things like education, which improves people's life in a long term, not just in one generation? It's going to change generations if you invest in education.
You really need to go granular. You need to grow granular, because if we go just saying we need to invest more in education, everybody will agree, but that's motherhood and apple pie. We need to say where, how, with what focus. And I will tell you that if we have budgets that are not unlimited, I will tell you the most effective investment in education is for the most vulnerable families from 0 to 3 years old. Invest in early child care education. Why? Because what happens is that these kids that I was referring to, that if you belong to a very low income family, then it's very difficult that you change your status. You need these public investments when they are going to be really making the difference. And these children from 0 to 3 years, that is where the brain development is really advancing, you make that investment and it really helps you into their learning performance all through the year. So yes, education is very important, but priority to those that are at the bottom of the income distribution, priority to those interventions like the early child care education, where it will really bring up the whole population.
You've been part of the G20 for a long time now, and G20 is basically a debating and a platform for dialogue. Compared to that, how do you think that dialogue of civilizations, organizations like this, and deliberations like this, what's happening here in Rhodes, help get people together, or do they help at all?
I think it's a fantastic, it's the first time I come, and I'm really enjoying it, because everybody comes here to engage in real meaningful discussions. In the G20, of course, things happen. Things happen when you see that the president of the US and the president of China are getting together in a bilateral, or when India is meeting some other friends around the table, because it's about people. Everything is about people. And if you talk, if you communicate, you will find solutions. And I think that this is exactly the very same understanding that I find in this dialogue of civilizations. Although it's beyond the OECD mandate, because we don't deal with the very existential questions that this dialogue is trying to address.
Yes, but ultimately we have to keep talking, we have to keep engaging in dialogue with countries, and that's the message, very positive message. Gabriela Ramos, thank you very much for talking to GoNews.
You're welcome. No, it's an honor. Thank you so much.